That's the whole video up. And I really didn't want to leave a video up like that because I actually wanted to show you guys what I was talking about. And just for the replay value of it, I couldn't have a whole video up where the entire video I'm not showing none of the slides that I'm actually talking about. That would just be crazy. So I apologize to the people that were already watching, and I cut it off mid video. I really do apologize about that. If you were watching, I'm going to have to go over a lot of that same information that I just that I just went over, unfortunately. But yeah, I wish I would have caught that sooner. I really wish I would have caught that sooner that my screen share wasn't working properly. So we're going to try this again. Hopefully I can get the screen share to work properly. If not, I'm gonna have to try to figure out that problem before I can actually move on. Before I can move on. See, it's doing it again. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why my screen share isn't. Let me try to fix this. Appreciate your patience. Just bear with me. Bear with me for just a second. Let me try to figure out why this isn't working, so I can get it to work. That way, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about as I talk about it. Let me pull it up again. Okay. So it's not letting me blow up the slide. That's what it's doing. Just a second. Just a second. I gotta figure this out. Got to figure this out, man. Got to figure this out. Maybe if I do it like this. Let me see if this will work, family. Hold on. Thanks for tapping in. If you was already tapped in, thanks for watching. No, that's not better. Let's try it like this. And like I say, just give me just a few seconds to correct this problem. And then we're going to dig right off into it. Let me try this. Man, I never had this problem before. This is weird. This is really weird. This how I share my screen every single time. Okay. Let's try it. Let's try it like this. Let me see if this will work. Okay, testing. All right, I think we have to do it like this. Sorry about that downtime. I apologize greatly. I hate when the video messes up like that. I hate when it's a lot of dead air, and I hate when I have to redo a lot of stuff that I already did. I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate y'all tapping back in. I'm sorry I got to go over some of this same information. I really do apologize, but you know how it go, man. When you got technical difficulties, there's nothing you can do about it but deal with it. Okay, all right. Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, my screen share wasn't working, Bigfoot. I just was doing this video. I went about 30 minutes, and I thought my slides was changing. None of my slides was changing, and it was on the first slide the entire time. And but No use crying over spilled milk. Let's just start it over. Grand Rising, family. We're just gonna start it over. We're just gonna get into it. Today we're gonna be dealing with the interesting life of a U.S. colored soldier, Ancestor Richard Slaughter speaks. Now, what is a U.S. colored soldier? A big misconception is that during the Civil War, our ancestors were waiting around on the plantation waiting to be saved. Now, yes, it is true that the majority of our ancestors were on the plantation and they gained their freedom from the events that transpired during the Civil War. But what is not widely known is that during the Civil War, our people actually fought alongside the Union soldiers. Yes, some of our ancestors fought with the Confederates. That's true as well. But the majority of our ancestors, they fought for the Union Army. They put on their uniforms, they picked up the flag, they picked up their rifles, and they shed their own blood and they shed enemy blood to gain our freedom. And had it not been for the contribution of what we call today the U.S. colored soldiers, the Union Army would not have been able to win the Civil War. So there's not enough attention paid to the U.S. colored soldier. There's not enough honor given to the U.S. colored soldier. And I think that a lot of our people do not know the relevancy that their ancestors played in the fighting of the Civil War. They did their part to make that war successful. So let's get right off into it, family. What is the U.S. colored troops? Now, the U.S. colored troops were Union Army regiments during the American Civil War that primarily comprised African Americans, with soldiers from other ethnic groups also serving in USCT units. Established in response to a demand for more units from Union Army commanders, by the end of the war in 1865, USCT regiments, which numbered 175 in total, constituted about 1/10 of the manpower of the Army. Approximately 20% of USCT soldiers were killed in action or died of disease and other causes, a rate about 35% higher than that of white Union troops. Numerous USCT soldiers fought with distinction, with 16 receiving the Medal of Honor. The USCT regiments were precursors to the Buffalo Soldier units, which fought in the American Indian Wars. Now, a lot of us are familiar with the Buffalo Soldiers. And case in point, I actually have one of my ancestors who was born in Alabama in 1848. At the end of the Civil War in 1867, I have documentation of one of my ancestors enlisting to actually be one of the first Buffalo Soldiers. Right? But the Buffalo Soldiers, they were not created until around 1866, after the end of the Civil War. So while a lot of us know about the Buffalo Soldiers, and they know about the Buffalo Soldiers fighting in the American Indian Wars, not many people know about the U.S. colored troops. They do not know about the African Americans who fought in the Civil War and helped to make the Civil War a success. And basically, prior to the U.S. colored troops being established as regiments that fought alongside the white Union soldiers, it was a major question of whether or not they should put guns into the hands of the Negro population. A lot of people didn't know if they put the guns into the hands of the Black Americans, would they turn on the Union and the Confederacy and just try to get revenge for centuries of slavery? So a lot of people was apprehensive about giving our ancestors guns and about teaching them how to fight and allowing them on the battlefield to spill blood. But what happened was it got to the point where the president, Abraham Lincoln, and along with the commanders in the Union Army, it got to the point to where they realized that they would not be able to win the Civil War if they did not employ the help of the U.S. colored troops. The U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act in July 1862. The U.S. Confiscation Act freed slaves whose owners were in rebellion against the United States. Congress almost immediately passed the Militia Act that empowered the president to use free blacks and former slaves from the rebel states in any capacity in the army. Now, before they put rifles into their hand, the Union Army was already using, the free blacks to do tasks like carrying supplies, digging trenches, building up forts, putting up tents, carrying food back and forth, carrying ammunition back and forth. They were already using the formerly enslaved people for tasks such as that within the Union Army. But like I told you, they were apprehensive about putting rifles into their hands. But when they realized that they couldn't win without extra help, they decided to put the guns into their hands and actually give them uniforms and make them soldiers. President Abraham Lincoln was concerned with public opinion in the 4 border states that remained in the Union, as they had numerous slaveholders, as well as with Northern Democrats who supported the war but were less supportive of abolition than many Northern Republicans. At first, Lincoln opposed early efforts to recruit African American soldiers, although he accepted the army using them as paid workers. In September 1862, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that all slaves in rebellious states would be free as of January the 1st. Recruitment of colored regiments began in full force following the proclamation in January 1863. So what I want you to take away from that is, why would President Lincoln at first be opposed to recruiting African Americans as soldiers and then change his mind? He only changed his mind because, when I want to drive this home, they realized they could not win the Civil War without arming the blacks, without arming the ex-slaves. So our ancestors were an integral part to the Union victory in the Civil War. Now, like I told you, not only was it a question of whether or not the quote unquote Negro or ex-slaves would try to get revenge if they were armed and taught how to fight, it was also a question among the white generals and combat leaders of whether or not the Negro would even fight. Right? You have to imagine that for centuries they had enslaved an entire group of people, an entire population of people, and they saw them as less than human. They saw them as born to serve. The institution of slavery cannot run unless you have in your mind a particular painted image of the African American population, and they saw them as not being men like they were men, not being human like they were human. So there was a great question of whether or not you put a gun into their hand, they would even fight bravely and valiantly. But what they found out is that without any formal military training, without any formal education, fresh off the plantation, they put guns into the hands of our ancestors. They put uniforms on their backs, and our ancestors fought so valiantly and bravely that the same race of people who had enslaved them just a couple of months earlier had no choice but to sing their praises. So a few quotes that I want to get into to highlight this fact before I go into the actual oral history of the ancestor Richard Slaughter, are documented for us in W.E.B. Du Bois' book, Black Reconstruction in America. Now, this quote was in the New York Times in 1863. Mind you, 1863 is directly in the middle of the Civil War. They said, Negro soldiers have now been in battle at Port Hudson and at Wilkinson's Bend in Louisiana, at Helena in Arkansas, at Morris Island in South Carolina, and at or near Fort Gibson in the Indian Territory. In 2 of these instances, they assaulted fortified positions and led the assault. In 2, they fought on the defensive, And in one, they attacked rebel infantry, showing that they had been in multiple battles in multiple states, and they held multiple different positions on the battlefield. In some positions, they were the aggressor. In some positions, they had to defend the location, and in some positions, they directly attacked rebel infantry. Now, look, in all of them, they acted in conjunction with white troops and under command of white officers. In some instances, they acted with distinguished bravery, and in all, they acted as well as could be expected of raw troops, meaning without any formal training, without ever being, think about it, they never held a gun in their life. Without ever holding a gun in their life, without ever being placed in formation, without ever being taught any of the rules of war, from coming fresh off of a plantation with no education whatsoever, they held their own on the battlefield. Now, General Thomas, a general in the Union Army, said, when General Thomas rode over the battlefield and saw the bodies of colored men side by side with the foremost on the very works of the enemy, he turned to his staff saying, "Gentlemen, the question is settled. Negroes will fight." Remember, it was a question of whether or not the Negroes, the colored troops, would actually fight. And when they saw them in battle, the question was settled once and for all. And not only did they fight for their freedom and for the freedom of their families, they shed their blood on the battlefield. And they also shed the blood of the Confederates on the battlefield. They went head to head, toe to toe with their oppressors, and they stood like men. That's the story that doesn't get told quite often about the American Civil War. In the New York Herald, May 1864, someone was quoted as saying, "The conduct of the colored troops, by the way, in the actions of the last few days is described as superb. An Ohio soldier said to me today, I never saw men fight with such desperate gallantry as those Negroes did. They advanced as grim and stern as death, and when within reach of the enemy, struck about them with pitiless vigor that was almost fearful." Another soldier said to me, "These Negroes never shrink, never hold back, no matter what the order. Through scorching heat and pelting storms, if the order comes, they march with prompt, ready feet. Such praise is great praise, and it is deserved." So even the individuals who held our ancestors enslaved, when they saw how valiantly they fought on the battlefield, they had no choice but to sing their praises. They said, "Damn, I ain't never seen in my life, never seen somebody in my life fight with such fearlessness." So you have to understand something. Our ancestors were not held in bondage for so long because they were cowards. They were held in bondage for so long because the institution of slavery itself, it was diabolical, and it was very intricate, and it was extremely difficult to get out of. Not without lack of trying. There were many rebellions. There were many revolts. There were many attempts and attempts to get free. Many people escaped. But the institution as a whole, it was just so well put together, right? It was just so well put together that it was hard to get out of. But we see as soon as they put rifles into the hands of our ancestors, they came away from it saying how fearless and brave they were. Now, the New York Tribune, July 26, 1864, quotes, "In speaking of the soldierly qualities of our colored troops, I do not refer especially to their noble action in the perilous edge of the battle. That is settled." Listen to that. Noble action. Just a couple of months ago, you were calling them slaves. Now they are noble. What would change that in an individual's mind? Seeing how valiant they were on the battlefield. That is settled. But to their docility and their patience of labor and suffering in the camp and on the march, meaning they were also humble and without ego. No matter how violent that they could be on the battlefield, they were impeccable troops. Now listen to this. This is a brief story on the battlefield about Major Dumas, the hero Negro officer. Now, after I finish these quotes, I'm going to get into our specific story. But listen to this. In April, there were 3 white companies from Maine and 7 Negro companies on Ship Island, the key to New Orleans. The black troops with black officers were attacked by Confederates who outnumbered them 5-1. Now, the Confederates have the black officers outnumbered 5-1. The Negroes retreated so as to give the Federal gunboat Jackson a chance to shell their pursuers. So the Negroes do what's known as a tactical retreat. They're outnumbered 5-1. Now, they are brave enough to just deal with it on the ground, and let's just go shot for shot, blow for blow, bayonet stab for bayonet stab. But they do what's called a tactical retreat. And so they do a tactical retreat. They flee so that the Confederates will pursue them. This is spoken of in Sun Tzu's The Art of War. You retreat to draw your enemy out of position to where you can conquer them totally. And so the Negroes tactically retreat so the Federal gunboat Jackson can boom, 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 boom from the shore, gun them down, right? But check this out. But the white crew on the Jackson disliked the Negro soldiers and opened fire directly upon the black troops while they were fighting the Confederates. So the black troops, the U.S. colored troops fighting for the Union Army, get shot at by the Union Army. Their own army shoots at them. Whoever's behind the gun was such an immense racist that instead of shooting at the enemy, the Confederates, they shot at the Negro soldiers. But look what happens. Major Dumas, the Negro officer in command, rescued the black men, repulsed the Confederates, and brought the men out safely. So without any help from the gunboat, the Jackson gunboat, they were able to subdue the Confederates who had them outnumbered 5-1, avoid being shot by the Federal gunboat Jackson, and get his men out safely. The commander called attention to these colored officers and said they were constantly, and this is the U.S. colored troops, they were constantly in the thickest of the fight, and by their unflinching bravery and admirable handling of their commands contributed to the success of the attack and reflected great honor upon the flag. These are your ancestors. Another quote says, black men were repeatedly and deliberately used as shock troops when there was little or no hope of success. They were sent on suicide missions. In February 1863, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higgins led black troops into Florida and declared it would have been madness to attempt with the bravest white troops what successfully accomplished with black ones. So what the U.S. colored troops were able to accomplish, this Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higgins said it would have been madness to attempt such a feat with the bravest white troops in the entire Union Army. It would have been madness to even attempt it. But the U.S. colored troops successfully accomplished it. This is the stock that you descend from. The problem is solved, they said. The Negro is a man, a soldier, and a hero. Remember, before they put the gun into their hand, there was a question: would the Negro even fight this class of people that they had enslaved? And the matter was settled once and for all when they saw the bravery of the U.S. colored troops. So our ancestors fought, bled, and died in the American Civil War, not just after. They fought in the American Civil War, and had they not fought right alongside the Union Army would not have won. Remember that. And so as I bring a close to these quotes and I move into the actual slave narrative of Richard Slaughter that I'm going to be dealing with today, I thought this picture basically sums up what I'm talking about. If you look at this picture, you see that the picture is of what's called an auction and Negro sales. This is one of the buildings where our ancestors would be taken into and bidded on and sold. Now, in front of this building, now this is in 1864 in Georgia, the heart of the South. In front of that building sits one of our ancestors, and he's reading a book, and he has his rifle leaned up against the window. And this picture is just a picture is worth 1,000 words, where they're saying never again, never again. Look, a United States colored troop infantry corporal is sitting by the door. And he's sitting by the door reading a book with his rifle leaned up against the window, saying, the days of slavery is over. The days of slavery is over. The Union went to war with the Confederacy. In order for the Union Army to win, they had to put guns into the hands of the Negro, the African American. Once they got them guns in their hands and they got that little taste of freedom, it was never again. What's going on, Stacy Hotel? Thanks for tapping in. You say upstate New York is in the building. Hey, okay. Shout out to upstate New York. Thanks for tapping in, family. But yeah, a picture is worth 1,000 words, man. In 1864, you got one of the U.S. colored troops sitting in front of the auction house. Basically, you will never sell none of my people in here again. That's what he's saying. So let's get into the specifics, family. Now that we got a good understanding of what the U.S. colored troops are, and we got an understanding of the contribution that they made in the Civil War, let's look into the life of one of these U.S. colored troops from slavery until the time of his enlistment. Now, this ancestor's name is Richard Slaughter. He was born January the 9th, 1849, and his age at the time of the interview was 88 years old. The place that he was enslaved is a place called Epps Island, City Point, and his slave owner was one Dr. Richard B. Epps. Okay, and you guys know what I like to do with these videos. I like to not only tell you what the ancestor said, but I go step by step and I validate and I prove everything that they say. Because you're going to encounter people who are going to try to discredit the historical value of the slave narratives, aka our oral history of our ancestors. So whenever you watch my videos on the subject, I validate and I prove with extra sources everything that they said to show you that our ancestors are telling the truth. Okay, now check this out. The ancestor says, I was born January the 9th, 1849 on the James at a place called Epps Island, City Point. I was born a slave. How old am I? Well, there's the date. Count it up for yourself. My owner's name was Dr. Richard B. Epps. I stayed there until I was around 13 or 14 years old when I came to Hampton. Now, I love these slave narratives and these oral histories because they give us so much information. We can pinpoint exactly where they were at, and we can pinpoint exactly the families that they say enslaved them. Now, this is important because these people have descendants that are still alive to this day. Right, that are still alive to this day. We can actually trace their descendants. But the first thing we have to do is prove what they have to say. So the man that you see on your left, that is an actual picture of Dr. Richard B. Epps. This is the man that the ancestor is claiming owned him. He was born on this man's plantation. Now, Dr. Richard Epps was a prominent planter in Prince George County, Virginia, and a surgeon in the Confederate States Army during the American Civil War. Notice that they say he was a surgeon, and the ancestors said that he was Dr. Richard Epps. Yes, he was an actual medical doctor and a plantation owner. They say that his Appomattox Manor, his plantation, one of three of his plantations, his Appomattox Manor was used as a base by Union General Ulysses S. Grant during his siege of Petersburg, Virginia. When the Union Army was invading the Confederate States, what they did a lot of times is they commandeered the land of the plantation owners. After they ran them off, they commandeered their land and their houses, and they took their resources to feed the troops. They took any kind of money that they found, in war. To the victor go the spoils, and they set up camp on these plantations because they were these multi acres of land where regiments of the Union Army could set up shop. So the guy, Dr. Richard Elps, that this particular ancestor was enslaved to, his Appomattox Manor plantation was used as a base by the Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Now look down where it says plantation owner, and I have it highlighted. At the time of the Civil War, Elps owned nearly 130 slaves and 2,300 acres at City Point and Elps Island, directly across the James River. What did the ancestor say? I was born January the 9th, 1849 on the James River at a place called Elps Island, City Point. They're giving us geographical information that is accurate. Now look, at City Point and Elps Island, directly across the James River. He had given up his medical practice, Dr. Richard Elps, to manage his 3 plantations. So far, so good. What the ancestor is telling us is checking out. Now, this family in Hopewell County, Virginia, is the actual Appomattox Manor that is the plantation home of Dr. Richard Elps, where General Ulysses S. Grant based his headquarters in the middle of the Civil War. Now, Appomattox Manor sits on lands that were first patented to Francis Elps in 1635. The area around the plantation was first settled in 1613 and was first known as Bermuda City. It was later renamed City Point. The house was first built in 1763 with substantial additions over time. Now, I want to show y'all something. A lot of people right now today, they come from what's called old money. Have you ever heard the term old money? When someone says that a person's family has old money, they're saying that their grandparents and grandparents, great-grandparents, they've been rich. Now, even when you go back to slavery days, a lot of the individuals that ran major plantations, they came from old money. So the individuals now with old money, they really have ancient money because they have money from the individual plantation owners who had old money that came from the original colonizers when it was no America. It was only the 13 colonies. So some of this money that people have today is not old money, it's ancient money. Even people like George Washington, like the president, George Washington, the first president, he is known for living at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is a slave plantation. He inherited that from his father. You understand what I'm saying? So even George Washington didn't build a legacy. Yeah, well, he built a legacy being the first president of the United States. But I'm saying he came from money. Okay, and a lot of those early presidents and a lot of those early movers and shakers in the 13 colonies and a lot of those movers and shakers in early America, they came from money. A lot of people that migrated over here from them other European countries, they came from money. Now, no, every white person didn't own slaves, but the ones on top is what I'm talking about. They come from old money, and now that old money in today's time is ancient money. The ancestor goes on to say, I don't know much about the meanness of slavery. There were so many degrees in slavery, and I belonged to a very nice man. He never sold but one man, far as I can remember, and that was Cousin Ben. Sold him south. Yes, my master was a nice old man. He ain't living now. Dr. Elps died, and his son wrote me my age. I got it upstairs in a letter now. Now, that guy, Dr. Richard Elps, He kept extensive journals and diaries, and he kept a lot of information written about the people that was enslaved to him. And it's like some historical society in Virginia, they actually have his diaries on record right now. You can actually go over a lot of his diaries online if you just look it up. The ancestor goes on to say it happened this way. Now, they're saying it like this because, again, this is one of the slave narratives. This is an interview. So they're asking them specific questions. So the ancestor already told the interviewer that he had came to live in a place called Hampton, Virginia. Now, Hampton played a intricate role in the beginnings of the Civil War. So naturally, when he said he lived at Hampton, the interviewer asked him about it. So the ancestor says it happened this way. Hampton was already burnt when I came here. I came to Hampton in June 1862. The Yankees burned Hampton and the fleet went up the James River. So what is the ancestor talking about when he says that Hampton was already burned when he came there? Why is the burning of Hampton relevant, and why would the ancestor ask about it? And is it even true? Was Hampton actually burned? Let me get a sip of my coffee. Now check this out. In Hampton, Virginia today, there is actually a historical landmark marking a spot in Hampton, and it's given the story of what is known as the burning of Hampton, what the ancestor was just talking about. That is a legitimate historical reality. Again, the ancestor giving us real history. Now, look what it says. When Captain Jefferson C. Phillips, Confederate troops, set the town of Hampton on fire on the evening of August 7th, 1861, a house that stood on this King Street site was one of the many structures destroyed. Archaeology tells the story of its demise. Now, the landmark is saying that the Confederate troops set the town of Hampton on fire. If you remember, the ancestor said that the Union Army set Hampton on fire. Now, why is there a discrepancy between the two stories? I'll explain it. When Hampton was burned, it happened at the outset of the Civil War, before any serious battles between the Union and the Confederacy took place. Now, the Union Army was headed up the James River, and they were going to, it is purported that they were going to set up shop in the city of Hampton, and they were going to, from there, set up a military base so that they could conduct military operations in Virginia. Okay. And so when the city caught on fire, the initial reports came out saying that it was the Union Army or the Yankees that set the city of Hampton on fire. Now, later reports came out after that claiming that in fact it was the Confederates that set the city of Hampton on fire. And basically their reasoning was they didn't want the Union Army or the Yankees to be able to use that area as a military base. And the idea is, before we let it fall into the hands of the enemy, we'll watch the whole thing burn down. And so the ancestor is quoting some of the earlier reports about what actually happened to the city of Hampton. Now, when this event took place, as you could expect, it was talked about in all of the newspapers. And so in one of the newspapers, they ran a story where they actually said the Yankees had burned down Hampton, right? And so someone a regular citizen who was actually from that area wrote to the newspaper to, in their mind, correct the story. And they wanted to give them the real story of what happened. So On Saturday, August 10th, 1861, this was a message to the editors. Someone wrote this to the newspapers to correct them from saying that the Yankees burned down Hampton. The citizen says, your information is right as to the burning of Hampton, but wrong as to the means by which it was done. The town, with the exception of 2 or 3 houses, is utterly destroyed. It was done, however, by our own people to prevent its being appropriated to a far worse end than conflagration, that is, the fall and winter abode of the Yankees had runaway Negroes. The facts, as related to me by reliable persons direct from the place, are that General Magruder, who, by the way, has his eyes and ears in their places, had learned definitely and satisfactorily that General Butler had issued or was about to issue an order that the town should be very strongly fortified and occupied by his troops as his permanent quarters. This was doubtless a part of his plan for capturing a large number of slaves. So what this citizen is saying is that the plan from the Union Army was to seize Hampton, fortify it, use it as a base of operations, and not only use it as a base of operations to conduct military operations, but also during the Civil War, they were trying to economically cripple the Confederacy. So they were giving refuge to any of the slaves that could escape behind Union lines. So they were saying that once they had set up shop in Hampton, they were going to send out word to all of the plantations that if any slaves escaped the plantations and made it to Hampton where the Union Army was, they would have their freedom. So before they allowed them to use Hampton to set up military operations and to give sanctuary to the escaping slaves, the Confederates would rather burn the whole town down. Blessings, Brooklyn Zoo. Yeah, we back in the building, man. I got that slideshow to work. Sorry I had to end it earlier, brother. I'm glad you found your way back in here, man. Hotel, good to see you. So again, the Ancestor is historically correct about the burning of Hampton. Now, he said it was the Yankees. They're saying that it was the Confederates, but it was a toss-up back at that time of who actually did it. So the Ancestor goes on to say, my father and mother and cousins went aboard the Maritanza with me. You see, my father and 3 or 4 men left in the darkness first and got aboard. The gunboats would fire on the towns and plantations and run the white folks off. After that, they would carry all the colored folks back down here to Old Point and put them behind the Union line. Now, remember, in that letter to the editor I just read, they were saying that the people of Hampton were concerned about the Union Army providing sanctuary to escaped slaves because a big part of the Civil War is they were taking the slave labor away from the Confederacy. So as they went up the James River in their gunboats, the Union Army, when they would attack a place, they would send out word. They would send out word that, hey, anybody that can make it behind Union lines, you're free. And so a lot of the colored folks, a lot of the enslaved individuals, when they saw the Union Army approaching, they broke out and ran. They broke out and ran. And they ran to the Union lines. Okay. And so this is how the Union Army acquired such a large number of colored folks, who a lot of them became those colored troops in the first place. And so this individual is saying that him, his father, his mother, and some of his cousins made it onto a gunship named the Maritanza. They escaped to the Maritanza. Now listen to this. He says, I know the names of all the gunboats that came up the river. Yes, sir. There was the Galena. We called her the old cheese box, the Delaware, the Yankee, the Monitor. He says Monsker, but that's the Monitor, and the Maritanza, which was the ship I was aboard of. So he names off 5 different gunboats that he says came up the James River. Now, this is more information that we can either prove or disprove. He's saying that there was gunboats called the Galena, the Delaware, the Yankee, the Monitor, and the Mauretanza. And he says he escaped from slavery and got on the boat, the gunboat called the Mauretanza. So is the ancestor telling the truth? Or is the ancestor lying? Are these records of accurate historical value? I present to you the first gunboat that he mentioned, the Galena, the USS Galena, right? The USS Galena was a wooden-hulled, broadside, ironclad built for the United States Navy during the American Civil War. Let's put a check mark by that statement that the ancestor made. Now, what you got to understand, when they're talking about these gunboats, before the Civil War, the ships were made out of wood, okay? And so what they ended up doing is they took various ships that were made out of wood and they put iron plates around the hulls of them to make them ironclad ships to shield them from gunfire from the Confederate Army. And the Confederate Army did the same thing with some of their ships to protect it from gunfire from the Union Army. So these gunboats are ironclad ships, wooden ships plated with metal armor. And so we also have the USS Delaware that the ancestor mentioned. Now, the Delaware arrived in Hampton Roads on June 2nd, 1862 for service in Virginia waters until October 30th, 1862. Again, we're going to put a check mark by the historical relevancy of what the ancestor told us. We were in Hampton Roads. Hampton is the city that burned that the ancestor was telling us about. That's where he lived. Virginia is where they're at. He says that the Galena and the Delaware came up those waters. And now we have outside validation that he is telling the truth. He also mentioned another gunship, the USS Yankee. Now, the USS Yankee was a steam-powered side-wheel tugboat acquired by the Union Navy just prior to the outbreak of the American Civil War. Now, check this out. On April 30th, 1861, the Yankee received orders to Hampton Roads, the same location, for reconnaissance duty between the Rip Rads and Cape Henry, Virginia. Batteries manned by Virginia forces that had not yet been formally incorporated into the Confederate States Army at Gloucester Point, Virginia, fired upon the Yankee on May 7, 1861, doing little damage but reportedly wounding 2 Union sailors. Yankee returned fire with 4 shots and 2 shells, but the crew could not elevate its guns high enough to reach the shore batteries, and the Yankee broke off the action and returned to Hampton Roads. So now we have more historical validation that, yes, just like the ancestor said, the USS Yankee was in that same area and it was part of the war as well. The fourth gunboat that the ancestor mentioned was the USS Monitor. Now look, the USS Monitor was an ironclad warship built for the United States Navy during the American Civil War. The Monitor played a central role in the Battle of Hampton Roads, and on March 9th, under the command of Lieutenant John L. Worden, where she fought the casemate ironclad CSS Virginia, built on the hull of the scuttled steam frigate USS Merrimack to a stalemate. So again, the USS Monitor, just like the ancestor said, was a gunboat that came up those waters in the exact area that the ancestor said it did. And last but not least, the ancestor said that he was on a boat called the Mauretanza, and I present to you the USS Mauretanza. Now, the USS Mauretanza was a steamer acquired by the Union Navy during the American Civil War. She was used by the Union Navy as a gunboat to patrol navigable waters of the Confederacy to prevent the South from trading with other countries. Okay, after participating in the capture of Yorktown on May 3rd, 1862, Mauretanza shelled various points, including Wormley's Creek, Morrell's Inlet, and Fort Darling, Drury's Bluff. So just like the ancestor said, in the historical record, you had these Union Army gunboats coming up the James River. They were shelling various points, and when the Confederate armies would flee, our ancestors would escape. They would run to these boats, get behind Union lines, and thus they would gain their freedom. And this is how our ancestor Richard Slaughter gained his freedom. He goes on to say that same year, I had to drink my coffee. Hold on. He goes on to say that same year, the Merrimack and Monitor fought off Newport News Point. No, I didn't see it. I didn't come down all the way on the gunboat. I had the measles or the Mauretanza and was put off at Harrison's Landing when McClellan retreated from Richmond through the peninsula to Washington. I came to Hampton as a government water boy. So the ancestor was telling us that the same year when he escaped and was on the Mauretanza, he says that the Merrimack and the Monitor had a fight on a place called Newport News Point. This is more historical information that we can either validate or invalidate. So again, is the ancestor telling the truth or is the ancestor lying? Because what you're going to find out is there are those who have written articles who try to discount the historical relevancy of what we're calling the slave narratives, aka this oral history of our ancestors. But when I do my research, I find that time and time again, they're doing nothing but telling the truth. So was there a battle between two ships called the Merrimack and the Monitor in a place called Newport News Point? Or is the ancestor making stuff up? Well, I present to you on the left, they actually have a historical marker talking about the Monitor and Merrimack battle. Look, from this spot, March 9th, 1862, observers anxiously awaited the outcome of one of the most famous naval battles of all time between the Confederate ironclad Virginia, formerly USS Merrimack, and the Union ironclad Monitor. After 4 hours inconclusive combat, with neither vessel able to destroy the other, the contest ended in a draw. But the world took notice, and the age of iron shipbuilding was so ushered into being there. And they're saying that this particular battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack was one of the first ironclad gunboat battles ever, and definitely within the Civil War. These were the two. This was the first time when the Confederate Army had an ironclad gunboat, the Union Army had an ironclad gunboat, and they did war. So the historical significance of this battle, you may have never heard of it before, but the historical significance of this battle cannot be denied. And this battle was spoken of in our oral histories way back in 1937. And we actually have the first-hand account of someone who didn't witness it with their own eyes, but was in the area and was on another one of the gunboats in the area when this actually took place. And so they were like literally on the ground. Now, when they're talking about the Merrimack, the Merrimack is actually the Virginia. Like the Confederate Army had took a disabled Union ship called the Merrimack, and they had repurposed it for their own use in the war. And they had renamed it the Virginia. Okay, so look, check this out. According to Britannica.com, the Battle of the Monitor and Merrimack. In the American Civil War, naval engagement at Hampton Roads, Virginia, a harbor at the mouth of the James River, notable as history's first duel between ironclad warships and the beginning of a new era of naval warfare. Our ancestor already told us about this historic first duel. Now, the Northern-built Merrimac, a conventional steam frigate, had been salvaged by the Confederates from the Norfolk Navy Yard and rechristened the Virginia. So the Confederates got a hold of a Union boat and they basically repurposed it. They fitted it up with iron protection. They covered up the wooden hull with iron plates, and they used it as a ironclad gunboat. And they changed the course of history and had history's very first duel between two ironclad warships in the world took place right there. And this is what our ancestor is talking about. So he goes on to say, while I was aboard the gunship Mauretanza, she captured a rebel gunboat at a place called Drury's Bluff. When I first came to Hampton, there were only barracks where the Institute is. When I returned, General Armstrong had done right smart. So here, the ancestor is now telling us that while he was actually aboard the Mauretanza, she captured a rebel gunboat. So in this instance, he's actually physically seeing with his own eyes some battle in the American Civil War. He's right there on the ground, and the gunboat that he is on, while he is on it, they captured a rebel gunboat. So what is the rebel gunboat that the Mauretanza captured while our ancestor is saying that he was on it? Well, it is the CSS Teaser, the C standing for Confederate, obviously. The CSS Teaser had been the aging Georgetown, D.C. tugboat York River until the beginning of the American Civil War, when she was taken into the Confederate States Navy and took part in the famous Battle of Hampton Roads. Later, she was captured by the U.S. States Navy and became the first USS Teaser. Look, when seized by Mauretanza, Teaser was carrying on board a balloon for aerial reconnaissance of Union positions at City Point and Harrison's Landing. So when the ancestor says that a Confederate gunboat, was seized and captured by the gunboat that he was on, the Mauretanza, again, he is historically accurate. So you got to understand what you're seeing here. At the height of the Civil War, this ancestor escaped to freedom on one of the gunboats, and he's in the thick of the action. This is where it's going down at. He knows all of the key players, all of the key players on the field. He knows all of the key locations, and he knows exactly what's going on. He knows about the burning of Hampton. He knows about the season of the CS Teaser. He knows about the first battle between two ironclad warships in history. He's right there for all of it. This particular ancestor right there. He's right there for all of it. And he gives us all of this history in the slave narratives, the AKA the oral histories. And just so you know, they actually have pictures of the teaser, the gunboat that he's talking about. And they say, look, 100-pound gun on board the Confederate gunboat Teaser, which was captured on July 4th by the Mauretanza, i.e. Mauretanza. Now, this is a digital file from the original front. So this is actually a picture of the Teaser that was captured on the 4th of July. And so you can see exactly how they were fitted out. This is why they call them gunboats. So you have these wooden boats that was used during the American Civil War, and they fitted them out with guns. They put cannons on the decks of them, and they even in the sides of the ships, they had guns sticking out the sides to where they could shoot at each other. And so this is why they started plating them with iron, so that when you would shoot at when your enemy would shoot at you with a gun or a cannon, like this 100-pound gun that's on the Teaser, hopefully the iron that is plating your wooden ship will protect you from the actual blow. So this is the actual picture of a 100-pound gun that was on the Teaser. So our ancestor Richard Slaughter saw this boat get taken captive by the Mauretanza. He was on the boat that captured this particular warship. as they were shooting back and forth. So the ancestor goes on to say, I left Hampton still working as a water boy and went to Guyer Creek, Belle Plains, Virginia, a place near Harper's Ferry. I left the creek aboard a steamer, the General Hooker, and went to Alexandria, Virginia. Abraham Lincoln came aboard the steamer and we carried him to Mount Vernon, George Washington's old home. What did he look like? Why, he looked more like an old preacher than anything I know of. Have you ever seen any pictures of him? Well, if you've seen a picture of him, you've seen him. He's just like the picture. Now, I want y'all to think about something. In addition to all of this other key moments in history that this ancestor was privy to, that he was present for, this ancestor actually met President Abraham Lincoln, right? Now, you may think it's a lie, but I'm going to prove it in just a second. But while he was working as a water boy for the government, remember earlier they said before they made the U.S. colored troops a fighting force, they used the escaped slaves to do various tasks within the Union Army. They carried supplies back and forth. Remember, they dug trenches, they built up forts, they built up fortifications and things like that. And so before the actual establishment of the U.S. colored troops, this ancestor is saying that he worked as a water boy for the Union Army, packing supplies, i.e. water, taking water to the troops and whatnot. Exactly what they said they was using them for. Now, this is all leading up to when he had his moment to enlist. And when he had his moment to enlist, you better believe he enlisted. But this ancestor not only did he visually see with his own two eyes, or even the aftermath with his own two eyes, very relevant events in the history of this nation and the history of the Civil War, he also met a president, President Abraham Lincoln, by far one of the most famous presidents when you talk about the history of our ancestors here in America, the president that signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this could seem at first glance like just grandiose talk, to where you have this ex-slave and he's like, oh, well, yeah, I was even on the steamer and, the president came aboard the steamer that I was on and we carried him to Mount Vernon, George Washington's old home, no less. Not only is he talking about Abraham Lincoln, but they went to George Washington's home. Did this ancestor actually experience this? I'm going to tell you guys, yes, he did. If you go to the mountvernon.org website, they have a timeline of every president who took a visit or a pilgrimage to the Mount Vernon estate. Now, not every American president has been to Mount Vernon, but almost all of them have. And so they give you a timeline and a brief description of every president that went to Mount Vernon. And so when they get to Abraham Lincoln, look what they say in about 1862. Abraham Lincoln supposedly almost visited Mount Vernon. The president's steamboat apparently stopped by on a trip down the Potomac River in 1862, but was advised not to disembark the vessel. According to John Dahlgren of the Washington Navy Yard, I advised the president not to land and remain in the boat with him. Now, Mount Vernon is in Virginia, okay? George Washington's slave plantation is known as Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon was George Washington's slave plantation, the slave plantation he inherited from his father. Now, Mount Vernon is actually in Virginia. Now, all of this action that our ancestor is seeing is right there in Virginia. So they're telling you that the president was actually on a steamboat and he went down the Potomac River and he had stopped by Mount Vernon, George Washington's old home. And he was going to disembark the vessel and, pay his homage to the state of the first president of the United States. And during the Civil War, just like in any civil war, they do have places that they technically say it's off limits. There will be no fighting on these particular land masses. They do have what they call rules of war, but you can never be sure that your enemy is gonna quote unquote follow these rules of war. So Mount Vernon is in Virginia. Virginia is Confederate territory, and the Union is invading. So when Abe Lincoln went by Mount Vernon, the according to John Dahlgren of the Washington Navy Yard, he told the president, "Hey, look, I know you want to get off, and I know they say that this is neutral territory. I know you want to get off and pay your respects to Mount Vernon, but I don't think it's safe for you to get off right in the heart of Confederate territory. Somebody might, peel your muffin cap back blue, basically." But we have in the historical record President Abraham Lincoln on a steamboat going by Mount Vernon. And just as the ancestor said, Abraham Lincoln came aboard the steamer and we carried him to Mount Vernon, George Washington's old home. Notice, he's not talking about the gunboat that he was on, because he said he caught the measles when he was on the gunboat. He got off and he started working as a water boy for the United States government. Now, working as a water boy, he got on a steamer, right? A steamboat, and he's working for the Union Army on this steamer. Now, the ancestor says while he's on this steamer, he sees Abraham Lincoln. And then we come to find out in historical record, President Abraham Lincoln was actually on a steamboat, and he actually visited Mount Vernon, but the accounts is saying that he didn't actually get off, or he was advised not to get off the boat because he might be killed. Virginia was in the heart of Confederate territory. So as amazing as it may sound, that on top of everything else, our ancestor also met President Abraham Lincoln, his story checks out. He goes on to say, "You say you think I speak very good English? He. Well, son, I ought to. I've been everywhere." The interesting life of ancestor Richard Slaughter. "No, I never went to what you would call school, except to school as a soldier." Here we go. "I went to Baltimore in 1864 and enlisted. I was about 17 years old then. My officer's name were Captain Joe Reed, Lieutenant Stimson, and Colonel Joseph E. Perkins. I was assigned to the 19th Regiment of Maryland, Company B. While I was in training, they fought at Petersburg. I went to the regiment in 64 and stayed in until 67. I was a cook. They taken Richmond the 5th day of April, 1865. On that day, I walked up the road in Richmond." Now, remember what I told you guys in the beginning about the U.S. colored troops. At first, when the Civil War first kicked off, there was questions about whether or not they should arm the ex-slaves, the Negro population. And nobody wanted to arm them. They were afraid that they might turn on the Union and the Confederacy and seek revenge for centuries of slavery. And there was a question of whether or not these ex-slaves would even be brave enough to fight. So what first happened is, as these slaves were escaping these southern states behind the safety of the Union lines, the Union Army was using them in every capacity other than fighting capacity. But as the Civil War progressed, they realized that they could not win the war without arming the colored troops. They needed more fighting men. The Union Army would not win unless they got their hands on more fighting men. So it was suggested that they arm the colored people and create regiments of colored troops and use them in the war. So eventually they decided to do that. Okay, and so this ancestor is saying he got free when the Union Army invaded the Confederate States. He escaped to one of their gunboats. While on that gunboat, he was a water boy for the United States government. Then, when he got his opportunity to enlist in 1864, he went to Baltimore and he enlisted. Now, the Ancestor says, now this is before there's a Buffalo soldier. You know about the Buffalo soldiers, but they weren't created until 66. Before 66, our ancestors was already fighting in the heart of the Civil War. Now look, the Ancestor says that he was assigned to the 19th Regiment of Maryland, Company B. And he says that while he was in training, they fought at Petersburg. The 19th Regiment of Maryland, Company B, they fought at Petersburg. And he says he went to the regiment in 64 and stayed until 67. That's real important, that term of 3 years. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to look to see if we can validate, because we've already validated everything else. Can we validate this portion of the Ancestor story? Check this out, family. The 19th United States Colored Infantry Regiment. The 19th United States Colored Infantry was an infantry regiment that served in the Union Army during the American Civil War. The regiment was composed of African American enlisted men, mostly from southern Maryland and the state's eastern shore. Commanded by white officers, it was authorized by the Bureau of Colored Troops, which was created by the United States War Department on May 22nd, 1863. The 19th U.S. Colored Infantry was organized at Camp Stanton in Benedict, Maryland, beginning December 25th, 1863, and mustered in for 3-year service. Remember, he said he was a part of it from 64 to 67. And the historical record tells us that they were signing people up for like 3-year enlistment deals. You know how whenever you sign up for the Army, or you sign up for a particular amount of years, he signed up for 3 years. Look what it says. Initially posted to Provost Guard duty in Baltimore, Maryland, beginning on March 1st, 1864, they were described as having great proficiency in discipline and drill. So now we have evidence of the 19th United States Colored Infantry Regiment actually being in Baltimore, Maryland in 1864. And the Ancestor just told us that I was assigned, he says, I went to Baltimore in 1864 and enlisted in the 19th Regiment of Maryland, Company B. We see again, he's telling the truth. Look what he said. The 19th Regiment, they later participated in the siege of Petersburg. They participated in the siege of Petersburg. What did the Ancestor tell us? While I was in training, they fought at Petersburg. They fought at Petersburg. Everything that the Ancestor is saying is checking out with the historical record. Praised for their conspicuous gallantry, the victorious African American Marylanders were among the first Union troops to enter Richmond, Virginia, when the Confederate capital fell in April 1865. Listen to this. According to the historical record, in April 1865, Richmond, Virginia fell. And the 19th United States Colored Infantry Regiment, the African Americans, were among the first Union troops to enter the area. They were the first ones to enter the area in April 1865 when the Confederate capital fell. So check this out. What did the Ancestor say again? They taken Richmond the 5th day of April, 1865. He giving you the date. On that day, I walked up the road in Richmond. So the Ancestor is saying, when they took Richmond on the 5th day of April, 1865, he walked up the roads in Richmond. Now, an individual at first glance, well, did that really happen? Yes. The victorious African American Marylanders were among the first Union troops to enter Richmond, Virginia, when the Confederate capital fell in 1865, right here, that sentence that's talking about the ancestor Richard Slaughter. He's one of those people. Now, if an individual was just researching this and they read that statement, they won't have proper context. That all they would know is just, African Americans were one of the first troops to enter that walked on the streets. But now we see the backstory of one of these United States colored troop soldiers who actually walked along these streets. It was somebody they were enslaved on these streets, and they came back victorious. He wasn't walking with his head down. He wasn't walking afraid to look somebody in their eyes. He wasn't walking down the street and the patty rollers pulled up and they was, nigga, where's your pass? Show me where's your pass. Who do you belong to? Beat him. There wasn't nobody sicking dogs on him. You understand what I'm saying? Everything had changed. Everything had changed. Nobody was trying to tie him to a tree and whoop him. Nobody was making him work for free. You understand what I'm saying? Nobody was chasing him down. Nobody was asking him where his papers was at. Nobody was trying to sell him on the auction block. Nobody was threatening him. Nobody was telling him to put his head down and look at the ground. You understand what I'm saying? The man was just enslaved in Virginia, right? A couple years ago, he was just enslaved in Virginia. When the Union Army came, he escaped. He escaped on one of their gunboats. Seen fighting on the gunboats. Met the president of the United States on a steamer. Worked as a water boy for the Union Army. And when they start giving the African Americans rifles, shit, he went to Baltimore and, hey man, sign me up. He signed up for 3 years of fighting, right? He signed up for 3 years of fighting. And then when they finally took the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. That's the Confederate capital. That's the capital of the Confederate Army. When they finally whooped their ass, got on their ass, some of the first ones to walk down the streets was the African Americans. That's like walking in triumph. If you look in history, you hear about the triumph of like the Roman soldiers. When the Roman soldiers and the Roman armies, they'll go off to war and they'll be doing battle with an enemy. And then they capture the king, or they capture the chief, or they capture the leaders of the enemy army. What they'll do, if they have to kill them, they'll kill them. But what they like to do, they like to bind them up in chains, right? Bring them back to Rome, and then they'll have what they call a triumph. The army will walk through the streets and get praises. The people are yay, 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 and they'll walk down the streets with their head held high, and they'll have a triumph. So can you imagine? All of our ancestors didn't escape when Richard Slaughter escaped. Some of them were still being held captive by these Confederates. So when they walk through the streets with their uniforms on, carrying the flag, carrying their rifle, they walking through the streets with their head held high, with their hats on, buttoned up, medals on their chest, and they just put in that pain. They've been busting their guns. They've been in all these battles that I told y'all about in the beginning when I gave y'all all these quotes. They were in some of the hottest, fiercest battles. And then after the fact, when they take the capital and they walk down the streets, you got to imagine in your mind the scene. You got to imagine what it looked like. Some of the ones that couldn't get free until they took that capital. They yelling and screaming. It's probably some of their sisters saw them and they brother had came back for them. So their mama was still enslaved, and they saw their boy coming back with that gun, and they was like, boy, we finally free. They daddy, we finally free. They brothers and sisters and babies. You understand what I'm saying? They come back with their guns and they got their head held high, and they don't put in that pain to get the rest of their people free. And so they were some of the first ones to walk through the streets. And they ain't faceless individuals. They got names. May the ancestor Richard Slaughter, may his name live on forever, and may his memory never die. And some of the other ones, we may not never know their names, but since we know his story, we can kind of equate them all. They all got backstories. They all been whooped. They all been beat. They all been sold. They all been chained. They all been mistreated. And then when they got that gun put in their hand, they all put in that pain. And then they marched the streets victorious, man. May their name live on forever, and may their memory never die. Look, the 19th U.S. Colored Infantry mustered out of service January the 15th, 1867. What the ancestor said, I went to the regiment in 64 and stayed in until 67. Everything that he's saying is valid. Everything that he's saying is valid. You dig? Everything that he's saying is valid, man. Much respect to the ancestor. Much respect to the ancestor. Matter of fact, I'm gonna read that. He says, that's not part of the story. All right, look. He say, when we left Richmond, oh wait, that's just me highlighting that they walked down the road. He says, when we left Richmond, my brigade was ordered to Brownsville, Texas. We went there by way of Old Point Comfort, where we went aboard a transport. When we got to Brownsville, I was detailed to a hospital staff. We arrived in Brownsville in January 1867. The only thing that happened in Brownsville while I was there was the hanging of 3 Mexicans for the murder of an aide. In September, we left Brownsville and came back to Baltimore. Before we left, I was sent up the Rio Grande to Ringo Barracks as boss cook. I then returned to Hampton and lived as an oysterman and fisherman for over 40 years. I have never been wounded. My clothes have been cut off me by bullets, but the Lord kept them from off my back, I guess. So he's saying he was in the middle of some heavy fire, but he never actually got shot. He said the Lord protected him. But the bullets, some of the clothes he was wearing, he got struck by bullets. Bullets tore the clothes off his back. He had bullet holes in his clothes, but he never got hit personally. Right? He never got hit personally. He says, I tell you what I did once. Now the ancestors just finna tell us a fun story from his life. It wasn't all pain and fighting. He says, my cousin and I went down to the shore once, the river shore, up where I was born. While we were walking along, catching tadpoles, minnows, and anything we could catch, I happened to see a big moccasin snake hanging in the sumac brush, just swinging his head back and forth. I swung at him with a stick, and he swelled his head up, and he swelled his head all up big and reared back. Then I hit him and knocked him on the ground flat. His belly was very big, so we kept hitting him on until he opened his mouth, and a catfish as long as my arm jumped out just a flopping. Well, the catfish had a big belly too, so we beat him on his belly until he opened his mouth, and out came one of these women snapper pocketbooks. You know, the kind that closes by a snap at the top. Well, the pocketbook was swelling all out, so we opened it. And guess what was in it? 2 big copper pennies. I gave my cousin one, and I took one. Now, you mayn't believe that, but it's true. I've been trying to make people believe that for near 50 years. You can put it in the book or not, just as you please, but it's true. And I'm glad the interviewer put this in. That fish swallowed some woman's pocketbook, and that snake just swallowed him. I have told men that for years, and they wouldn't believe me. So the ancestor was saying that he came across a water moccasin, killed the water moccasin, beat the water moccasin, and the water moccasin had just swallowed a catfish. So he beat the catfish out of the water moccasin. The catfish swole up too. They beat the catfish, and the catfish had just swallowed a pocketbook, a woman's pocketbook, and in the pocketbook was 2 pennies. So the catfish ate some woman's pocketbook, the water moccasin ate the catfish, and he ended up catching and killing the water moccasin and getting the catfish and getting the pocketbook. And he said that nobody wanted to believe him. But now I'm not just no angler. I'm not no nature person. I don't be in nature all the time, but I do know a catfish will probably eat anything. And I have seen videos to where an individual, they'll catch something like an alligator or something, right? And the alligator will be done swallowed something that has swallowed something else. That's kind of just a circle of life. And based on everything else that the ancestor has said that has been verified as true, I'm choosing to believe this story. I believe he found a moccasin with a catfish in it, and in that catfish was a pocketbook. I don't understand why he'll tell that story. Why would he even bring that up in the midst of everything else that he's saying if it wasn't true? Now, you could believe that or not. That's up to you. The ancestor goes on to say, while I was away, my father died in Hampton. He waited on an officer. My mother lived in Hampton and saw me married in 1874. I bought a lot on Union Street for $100 cash. I reared a nephew, gave him the lot and a house I built on it, and he threw it away. How many times you seen somebody get left property and, they squandered it? When I moved around here, I paid cash for this home. Did slaves ever run away? Lord, now this finna get interesting. Watch what I do here, man. Watch what the real bookworm do here, man. Now, apparently the interviewer is asking, did slaves ever run away? And I'm finna show y'all a direct reference to the Underground Railroad. Man, it's people online, man. They be saying stuff like Harriet Tubman ain't real. The Underground Railroad ain't real. It was made up. I mean, it's just all kind of wild stuff. But and when I hear people talk like this, I know that they have never read like the literature that our ancestors themselves have written. They don't know because they just never read it. So they can be fooled. They never read the primary documentation. It's like once you read the accounts of people who escaped on the Underground Railroad, like people who escaped and met Harriet Tubman, and once you've read that, when you hear someone say something like the Underground Railroad ain't real or Harriet Tubman ain't real, you just kind of like, you just shake your head and be like, bro, I know people, through the historical record that actually escaped on the Underground Railroad. Many, many people, right? And they knew Harriet Tubman. So what I'm going to do here, even now, this ancestor, there's so much stuff in his record. He's going to give us a direct reference to the Underground Railroad, right? And I'm going to prove that this is true. I'm going to prove that this is true. So never let nobody tell you that the Underground Railroad ain't real. I know that a lot of people that watch my videos, y'all are smart, y'all are astute, y'all can't be easily fooled, but you just never know what you might hear. So if you ever hear that, man, just shake your head and laugh it out. So look, he say, did slaves ever run away? Lord, yes, all the time. Where I was born, Virginia, there is a lots of water. While there used to be as high as 10 and 12 Dutch three masters in the harbor at a time. I used to catch little snakes and other things like something, I don't even know what that is, terrapin, and sell them to the sailor for to eat roaches on the ship. Excuse me. Now look, listen to this statement. In those days, a good captain would hide a slave way up in the top sail and carry him out of Virginia to New York and Boston. So the ancestor talking about the Underground Railroad, and I'm approving. Look, he's saying that where he lived is next to a lot of water in Virginia, right? And he's saying that a lot of slaves in this area ran away. And he says that a lot of times the captains of these ships would hide runaway slaves on their boats and carry them out of Virginia to New York and Boston. Now I'm finna prove to you this is accurate, and I'm finna prove to you that he's talking about the Underground Railroad. Now look, in the book, The Underground Railroad Records by William Steele. Now William Steele lived in Pennsylvania. He was a free man who lived in Philadelphia, not Pennsylvania. That lived in Philadelphia, right? And he facilitated so many of our ancestors getting free. So many of our ancestors getting free, helping them actually make it to the free state and helping them make it from the free states to Canada. A lot of times they went to Canada. This man, William Steele, knew Harriet Tubman personally. And a lot of times when Harriet Tubman got people, when she went to the South and led people to freedom, a lot of times she led them to this man right here. And they have records of her leading people to this man right here. And then this man would take those who escaped and, get them where they needed to be, link them up with family members who had escaped prior, or family members who had bought their freedom prior, or get them to Canada. Now, look, in the Underground Railroad records, we have the story of one Jeremiah W. Smith and his wife Julia, who escaped slavery in Richmond, Virginia by boat, just like the ancestor Richard Slaughter described. Now, look what it says. But both Julia and her husband had seen enough of slavery to leave no room to hope that they could ever find peace or rest so long as they remained. So there and then they resolved to strike for Canada via the Underground Railroad. By a little good management, berths were procured for them on one of the Richmond steamers. Berths not known to the officers of the boat, and they were safely landed in the hands of the Vigilance Committee, and a most agreeable interview was had. The committee extended to them the usual hospitalities in the way of board, accommodations, and free tickets Canadaward, and wished them a safe and speedy passage. The passengers departed exceedingly lighthearted February the 1st, 1864. Now, this is around 10 years before the Ancestor joined the 19th Colored Regiment, right? That this group in Virginia, they escaped slavery in Virginia via the Underground Railroad. They got on a steamer in Richmond. They got on a boat, and they were carried from Virginia to the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia. And what would happen is the Vigilance Committee, who William Steele worked hand in hand with, they would pay these captains for bringing these slaves to freedom. Because a lot of times the enslaved individuals didn't have money, so they would pay them for their services, and then they would help the escaped slave get either find room and board in Philadelphia, or if they wanted to go all the way to Canada, they would pay for them to go to Canada so that they can enjoy their freedom. So when the Ancestor says that in those days, a good captain would hide a slave way up in the top sail and carry him out of Virginia to New York or Boston, we actually have a couple, Jeremiah W. Smith and his wife Julia, who escaped from Virginia that exact same way. Amazing. Amazing. So we know that the Ancestor is telling the truth. Now, the Underground Railroad, again, is simply a system by which our ancestors escaped the South and made it to free states. It's not like a specific route you have to take. It's not a specific underground cavern. It's nothing like that. Sometimes they're just talking about various houses or shops or stores along the way from point A to point B that would hide the escaped slaves and tell them which direction that they should go in next and who to look for in the next town over. And our ancestors would just go from location to location until they made it all the way to the north. Or in this case, they would get on a boat, and the captain of that boat would take them from Virginia and would take them all the way to the free states. And once they took them to the free state, the Vigilance Committee would pay them for what they did to help that ancestor escape. So even in this instance, the ancestor is giving us a direct reference to the Underground Railroad. Now look, check this out. The historical relevancy of the slave narrative of Ancestor Richard Slaughter, it doesn't even end there. This man had an amazing life. Look, he says, I never went in the Spanish-American War, too old, but I had some cousins that enlisted. That was during McKinley's time. Now, McKinley is one of the American presidents, for those that don't know. He went down the Texas, and some of them other ships they gave Puerto Rico, hell, Colombia. They blew up the Maine with a mine. She was blowed up inward. The Maine left Hampton Roads going towards Savannah. Then they looked at what was left of her All the steel was bent inward, which shows that she was blown up from the outside in. Now, pause. None of this may make sense if you haven't studied history. So why is he talking about the Spanish-American War? Why is he talking about Puerto Rico, Colombia, McKinley, Savannah? And why is he talking about the Maine being blown up with a bomb? I'll tell you why, family. Look, check this out. On January the 25th, 1898, the battleship steamed into Havana Harbor, the battleship Maine. McKinley, like the ancestor said, trying to steal the war drums, wanted the Maine to show the flag, prove that U.S. warships had the right to enter Havana and then get out. On February the 15th, the Maine was to head for New Orleans in time for Mardi Gras. By then, McKinley hoped anti-Spain fervor should have died down. So in the area of Cuba, right, in the area of Cuba in the 1890s, there was a lot of tension building up. And there was talks of wars, and there was talks of fights, and there was talks of it popping off. And so this is what led to what we call the Spanish-American War. Now, McKinley, the president of America at the time, and the general American public at large, they did not want to get into a fight with Spain. They did not want to get into a fight in Cuba. They didn't want to have a fight down there. They didn't want to have a war. They didn't want to do any of that. They were trying to avoid it, right? But in order to calm down the hostilities that were brewing in the area, the United States sent one of their battleships that was named Maine. They sent it to that area, right? Just to, like kind of like a show of power or force. They'll be like, okay, America, we can send warships down here if we want to. So you really don't want to cause no problems in this area, is basically what they were trying to say. Now, while the warship Maine was traveling through those waters around Havana and around Cuba, it blew up. Now, the destruction of that ship is what led to the Spanish-American War. When you talk about the Spanish-American War, this is what kicked it off. Yes, the tensions were already there in the area. I'm not saying this wasn't. But the reason America got in on it was because the Maine blew up. Now, if you don't know history, you don't know about that. So that's what the ancestor is trying to describe here. When the ancestor says they blew up the Maine with the mine, she was blown up inward. The Maine left Hampton Roads going towards Savannah. Okay, or Havana. That's Havana. That's what the ancestor is trying to describe. Look what they say. But at 2140, on the night of February the 15th, a massive explosion tore through the ship, killing 250 men and 2 officers. Mortal injuries raised the final toll to 266 dead. A court of inquiry questioned survivors, including commanding officer Captain Charles D. Sigsbee, and interpreted the reports of divers. The theory that a mine had destroyed the ship stemmed primarily from eyewitness territory. Now, why is this important? There was a lot of controversy about what caused the Maine to blow up, because the answer to that question was either going to start the Spanish-American War or prevent the Spanish-American War. If the Maine was attacked, America would have no choice but to fight. So some people were trying to say at the time that, it wasn't a mine that blew up the Maine. The explosion happened from the inside. But remember, what the ancestor is saying is when they examined the hull of the ship, the hole that the explosion made it was inward, like the metal was pressed inward, as if the explosion was on the outside and blew the metal inward. Now, if the explosion happened on the inside, the metal would have been blown outward. Okay, and so the initial the initial reports concluded that the main was blown up by a mine from the outside. And so, since it was deemed an attack on the United States, then the United States engaged in a war. It didn't last long. They kicked butt pretty quickly. But the Spanish-American War kicked off because of that. Now, in the outset of that, over the years, they did more investigations into what actually happened to the Maine, and then reports came out that, based on new findings, it wasn't a mine from the outside. The Maine blew up from the inside. But then years after that, you had more investigations done, and they said, well, no, that previous investigation was wrong. It actually was blown up from a mine, like the Ancestor said. Look, as the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Maine approached, David W. Woodall, senior researcher of the Editorial Planning Council of National Geographic magazine, suggested that the magazine commission an analysis of the disaster based on computer modeling not available to Rickover and his team. Now, Rickover and his team are the ones that contested the initial findings that the explosion was due to a mine. And they said that the Maine blew up from the inside. They say Advanced Marine Enterprises, AME, a marine engineering firm often used by the U.S. Navy, accepted the mission. The AME analysis, which was announced in the February 1998 issue of National Geographic, examined both the mine and the coal bunker theories. Now, the coal bunker theory is the theory saying that coal inside of the Maine ignited from the inside of the ship, blew up, and sunk the ship. So you have the mine theory, that it was an attack that blew it up from the outside using a mine. And you have the coal bunker theory saying that the Maine blew up from the inside. The report of the AME, the report declared that it appears more probable than was previously concluded that a mine caused the inward bent bottom structure and detonation of the magazines. So yes, some things inside of the Maine exploded, but that was due to the mine that blew up on the outside of the hole. So the latest investigation into what happened to the Maine validates the Ancestors story about that. And so, look, the Ancestor goes on to say, during the World War, that's crazy. Also, the Ancestor was alive for World War I, and he don't mention too much about it, but he mentions it briefly right here, World War. During the World War, I went to Washington and haven't been any place since. I'm a little hard of hearing and have high blood pressure, so I have to sit most of the time. Got an invitation in there now, wanting me to come to a grand reunion of Yankees and the Rebels this year, but I can't go. Getting too old. Well, goodbye, son. Glad to have you come again sometime. And we're glad that the Ancestor documented all of this stuff for our reading and listening pleasure. So this Ancestor was born in slavery. He saw the events unfold of the Civil War, escaped to freedom. He fought in the Civil War. He was alive during the Indian Wars. He was alive during the Spanish-American War. And he was alive during World War I. And he had information, valid historical information, to give us about all of these key periods in American history. So, family, this has been the interesting life of a U.S. colored soldier, Ancestor Richard Slaughter Speaks. Now, what I want you guys to do, again, when you think about this oral history and when you think about these slave narratives, I just want you to understand that the value of what's written within these documents is of immense importance. These are like the primary eyewitness, firsthand accounts of what happened. And yes, with these videos, I like to go to internet sites, and I like to use outside sources to validate what the ancestors are saying, just just to lend credibility to the stories that they are telling. And what I want you to understand is that when you're reading these stories, that they're giving you accurate information. See, a lot of people try to paint the picture like our ancestors were just like ignorant and dumb. But I tell people all the time, there's a difference between education and intelligence. You have education if you go to school and you are formally trained up, right? That's education. Intelligence is just your ability to learn, your ability to comprehend, your brain power. You can have the intelligence of a genius and have no education. You can have a college education and have limited intelligence. Imagine that. And so what happens when you read over these oral histories of our ancestors, you see how intelligent they actually are and how intelligent they actually were, regardless of whether or not they had an education or not. And they were not totally oblivious to what was going on around them. It's just a lot of times we don't know. We don't know what they had to say, and we don't know that they left us so many records. So I try to bring us these records, and I try to highlight these records so we can see firsthand what they have to say about what was going on during slavery. And so during the American Civil War, remember that the Union armies would not have won the American Civil War had it not been for the U.S. colored soldiers. So I hope you guys like this interesting life of a U.S. colored soldier. And I hope you guys heard something that you never heard before. I hope you guys, like myself, appreciate the ancestor Richard Slaughter for everything that he said and all the information that he left for us. Now, again, if you haven't already, make sure you like the video. Support the channel. I appreciate all of the support. Make sure you subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can be notified when I go live, and you can be notified whenever I drop a new video. It's Black History Month, so I want you to share this video so people can have some type of Black history, right, from the words of our ancestors themselves. Look at some of my other videos where I'm letting the ancestors speak. You can share those as well. This will be a good time to share a video like this for Black History Month. It flows along with the theme very nicely. I appreciate all you guys for tapping in, man. Appreciate that for real. And I appreciate all of the love and support. Everybody that support, I appreciate it. Everybody that hit the cash up, I appreciate it. Everybody that like, I appreciate it. Subscribe, share. I appreciate all of that, man. It's nothing but love for you guys. Really. So, thank you for watching Matthew Daniels TV. I am your illustrious host, Matthew Daniels, the writer, the scribe, the bookworm. But I'm not just a bookworm world. I am the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. I'm doing the book game like it ain't never been done before. And I'm doing the book game like it'll probably never be done again. Thank you for watching. And like I always say, family, let's make intelligence great again. Read a book, man.